Like over the last few years, I'm sure at some level all of you are tired of hearing about AI. Before I even start, right, what's interesting is 20 years back, as I was getting my PhD, back in those days, AI was not cool. It was the cold winter of AI. We were over-expecting too much from it. It didn't work to that level. So we would call it machine learning, statistics, all kind of things, but not AI. And I think that is very important to even today, to really understand what is AI, what it can do, when it works, why it works, what are the limitations. And so I thought what I can do is I can just start by simply answering what is AI. And you will go read books, blogs, and people will talk about all kinds of things, like machines that can mimic human intelligence, which is the most common definition that we hear. But to be honest, if I read that, I'm still like, so what does that really mean? Is it a human being? And to be very honest with you, the way I look at it, we have 8 billion people on this planet. I'm not looking for AI to be another human being. That's not what it is. So the simplest definition that I have personally, and many of the people in academics may disagree with me, is a simple machine that has an ability to process enormous amounts of data at lightning speed, make sense out of it, find patterns. So simply, whatever patterns you're finding from the data, just help you find that, and either automate things for you or assist you in making better decisions by providing you the right data at the right time. That's it. Anytime when someone has come to you and asked you for an advice about their career, and what you have done is you have mapped it to one patterns that you have seen in the past. Yeah, the people with this background have done this thing. Just doing that at a scale based on the data from much larger scale. That's it. But what has happened? Why do we need AI? The data explosion has happened. The amount of data that got generated in the last 18 months is a lot more than what got generated in the entire in the past. With globalization, with remote work, I can no longer be limited by my own neighborhood of the data. Today, what I don't know is so much larger than what I know. And it's not that I can ignore all that stuff. That is more relevant to me today. How many of you have heard of Stanford? Rhetorical question, right? How many of you have heard of Fudan University in China? And how many of you have heard of Jadavpur University in India? You know, that limited information, some of you know, some of you don't know, is what creates bias. It's not intentional. It's one of those jokes, right? When I come to you and I'm like, let me tell you about something very, very famous that you have not heard. I'm like, how can it be famous if I have not heard, right? How can it be good if I have not heard? So what is needed today is I can no longer be satisfied with the data that I have with my own limited memory. But with AI, with machines, with the compute available to us, can we do this at a scale, right? And actually, it is everywhere. AI at some level is not new. Whether anytime you have gone to a doctor, gotten a CAT scan for yourself or some of your family members, or MRI scan, that is AI in some sense. The ability to process those imagery, bounce off thousands of X-rays through your body in real time, and reconstruct your body parts. Or when you put your car on adaptive cruise or autopilot, it is taking the imagery in the real time, making sense out of that imagery, and effectively doing the same pattern matching that we do, right? Oh, there's a rain going on, so let me slow down. There's a lane is turning, so let me turn the wheels, right? And then there's a real-time feedback loop going on that has the car actually moved or not, right? Or the video conferencing, the fact that today, if any one of you remember the good old days of video conferencing 5 years back, right? The video will freeze, the audio will be choppy, and today it just works so smoothly. Because we know when to compress the packets, how to compress those packets, how to send them efficiently, right? Or when you go to Google and make your query, when you say that I'm looking for Michael Jordan, well, if maybe people in this room are making that query, you're not looking for the basketball player, you are looking for the professor from Berkeley. But key thing is being able to learn about the data, learn about your context. And why am I talking about all that stuff? Because AI in employment can have the biggest impact. And it's no longer even a choice. It's a necessity. And why it is, right? 25 years back, actually now almost 35 years. As I was thinking about my own career and growing up in India, and any one of you from there, right, might be able to relate to that. If you're doing your high school in math as a major, the only career path that existed for you was to become an engineer. That's all I knew. Do math, engineering, that's it. There's no other career path. So life was so simple, right? But what has happened is that now I can become an investment banker. I can become a data scientist. And it's no longer about whether you know math, but whether you know math and probability. But even it's no longer that, right? As you dig in more, there's so many other things possible. So if you know econometrics, actually, you can be a phenomenal data scientist. And all those things require you to be able to analyze the data. You can't look at it in silos. And really to do a good job at that, especially when I talk about the employment, right? There are only 8 billion people on this planet. Sounds like a very big number, right? 8 billion people. Today, Google is probably indexing multi-trillion documents. eBay or Amazon has an inventory of multiple billions of products, which is churning through on a daily basis almost. So 8 billion is actually not a lot. The fact is there are only 2 billion professionals out of that. So can we learn from the data of each of those billions of people what skills they have? And then as an organization, every time you're conducting interviews, you're screening the candidates, you're having someone go through performance review, you are collecting extremely valuable piece of data. But if you can do it through machine, what makes it interesting is that is when it scales. And the biggest thing that is interesting about Eightfold is today we have customers using us across the globe in 24 plus languages, across every industry, every vertical. And one of the reasons why we went very horizontal, very quickly, practically on day one. Like the common wisdom is that focus on one area, go deep over there, build a solution which is custom built almost for telecom industry, or tech industry, or healthcare industry, or med devices industry. Pick your favorite vertical, right? But again, that is when you introduce a bias. But by building it horizontal, you are able to bring the learnings across every vertical. What if many of you are seeing in your industry is very different from what someone else over here is seeing in their industry. And if I can marry the data from both places, those industries, those experiences. I can reduce the human bias. I can find patterns that otherwise were not available, exposed, and make much better outcomes. At this point, I would like to invite Sachit to come in and walk you through how at Eightfold, at every part of our product, we are bringing AI.
The real AI application that I personally am interested in is, can it actually help pick the perfect bottle of wine, for wine tasting in just an hour or so. I completely recognize that we are the panel that's standing between you and wine tasting, so definitely I think that could be a positive application, as the next step here. But on a serious note, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about Eightfold's AI and some of the applications that we have built over the course of the last half decade that we've been around as a company. Just by background, over the course of the last decade or so, I've had a chance to build some consumer products that many of you might use on a daily basis. And what's interesting about this is that, in big tech, AI is pretty pervasive everywhere. There's been over a dozen patents in my career that I've had the pleasure of filing at companies like LinkedIn and Uber, and they're definitely using all your data today to make a lot of different decisions that they do on a daily basis. When it comes to Eightfold, we've actually embedded AI in a lot of our experiences, right? Whether you look at our talent acquisition portfolio, whether you look at our talent management portfolio, a lot of the experiences that we have built for your employees, for your candidates, they're powered by AI today. And at the same time, we've also taken the steps as a company that started out as an AI company that's, just by accident ended up in the HR space. We put a lot of controls in place to make sure that we're actually doing this in an ethical and a fair way, because we do know that there comes a responsibility with using this data. So today what I want to do is just dive into a few of these examples and then talk to you about some of the measures that we've taken to do this in a responsible fashion. So first application here, I know there was a keynote this morning from EY where they definitely talked about sort of the things that they're trying to do with Skills Foundry. Well, I'm sure that each and every one of you that's out here that's in an HR function needs the same kind of data to make decisions. You need to understand your people, and you need to understand the skills that they bring to the table today so that you can make decisions on how to grow your workforce. What are the skills that you need to grow from the inside, and what are the skills that you need to acquire from the outside? A lot of this is possible on Eightfold today because of the AI that we apply to each and every one of your employee profiles. We have the ability to pull out their skills, to effectively create visualizations like the one that you're seeing on the screen right now. And when you start doing this, you can start to see patterns develop, right? You can see skills that are starting to grow, skills that are starting to decay, the skills you're losing to your competitors. All of this is possible using the power of the AI underlying our platform. The second application here is something that we brought to market just a quarter ago, which is our jobs intelligence engine. What, again, this allows you to do is to actually look at the skills across the entire market, across every single industry, hone it down to your particular industry, and to use the scale of that big data as well as the AI to start to infer roles that are critical within your organization. You can start doing this for every single role. In fact, when we interviewed HR professionals, just keeping track of all the roles within a corporation tends to be an incredibly onerous activity. Just doing this once a year can be backbreaking for HR organizations. Well, with the power of AI, you're actually able to do this in a real-time basis every single day. The AI is actually doing the hard work for you, aggregating the data and the skill sets, pulling them into a singular database that can then help you inform what should be the critical skills for any particular role at your company. The third application is actually the most popular application within our platform, and that is the ability to take any given position at your company, crunch it against tens of millions of profiles, sometimes hundreds of millions of profiles, and to figure out the top 50 or 100 people that are fit for a particular role. This is something that we innovated on right at the beginning of Eightfold. This is one of the top use cases on our platform. And what you're able to do with this is effectively take an activity that would take more than the human lifetime, right, for any one of your recruiters. Please don't make them go through 100 million profiles. AI can do this in real time and effectively get it down to the people that matter. And this is the kind of application where you could see the combination of AI and the human being working together to solve what would previously be an unscalable problem. Another thing that we are incredibly proud of is a focus on exploring all of the different career paths that are available to every single individual within your organization. Career pathing, again, tends to be something that is very difficult, right? We all get sort of tunnel vision in our roles that we occupy. And sometimes we miss the forest for the trees, and that's where the AI can come in. It can take all of the data, pull together all of the career paths of previous employees and previous leaders within your company, and start to expose these career paths to every single individual. And so it can effectively figure out the deltas between your current skill set and the next role that you really desire, and then start to give you the ways to actually make that happen. This is another thing that's possible using AI, which would otherwise be extremely difficult to do in a scalable fashion with just human intelligence. The other application that we also brought to market very recently is also a very difficult one to actually do just with human power, and that is succession planning. So one interesting thing about succession planning is it tends to happen sort of under the covers. It's hidden. These are positions that are never advertised within companies. And historically, there used to be a lot of bias, human bias, that crept into this process. That is something AI can take away. There are hidden gems of employees within every single company, people that have the skill sets to occupy these roles if only you knew that they existed. And that is what AI can uncover here. Going across tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, and figuring out who might be the best successor for any given role, taking into account diversity, taking into account fairness and transparency. And that's what AI can do. And then across all of these different experiences that I just talked about, we believe that transparency is the key. So when you look at the report that you're seeing here, this is a gender diversity report, which actually starts to expose, with transparency, to talent acquisition organizations within our customer base. How are you treating protected classes? In this case, by gender. Are there differences in the way that you're treating women versus men? This would be uncovered by the data set that we possess. Again, a way to create transparency, to create fairness, and to create the right controls within your company so that you're making the right decisions. This is the kind of thing that AI can actually enable. Now, across all of these things that I just talked about, there's also a science that goes into everything that we do at Eightfold. This is an industry that is evolving very, very rapidly when it comes to the ethical use of AI in all of the different experiences that I just talked about. And so behind the scenes, we have been working with our advisors. We've been working with industry leaders. We've been working to put in place the right controls so that we do the right thing. Many of the metrics that you see here, including AUC, which is area under the curve, it's a technical measure of are we actually doing the right thing when we bring out a new model to the market. When you look at precision, recall, these are traditional metrics that are used to actually measure a model precision as well as effectively the accuracy of the model. The perturbation test, which is what you see at the top side of the screen, it's effectively a way for us to take a particular profile, run it through our algorithms, change the gender, change the race of the person that's in this profile, and effectively measure, is our model actually treating the data fairly? Is it starting to change the scores as a result of some of these protected characteristics? And if that happens, we don't allow this model to actually ever make it to production. We also test for model stability, which is to make sure that with different data sets, different training data, that the model doesn't do anything that is unexpected. And the average match score is something that we also generate for every protected class, just to make sure that the models that we're bringing to market are helping our customers do things in a fair fashion, in an ethical fashion, and effectively are making it better relative to your current processes in terms of the outputs that it is producing. We've also taken into account the user experience here, because it's not just enough that the science works, it's also making sure that the human can actually be more effective. And so there are tools like effectively profile masking that we have brought to the market, which effectively strips out some of the protected characteristics like gender and race, and allows hiring managers as well as recruiters to make decisions that are more ethical and fair. In addition, we believe that transparency is the key here, which is we have a calibration process which allows you to actually tune the model yourself. And when you make any changes to the model in terms of a required skill, it actually shows you in real time what kind of impact it has on diversity. These are just some of the controls that we have built that allow your company to use this technology in a way that's fair. Lastly, we also have a policy of explainability at Eightfold, which is every single thing that we do, we don't treat AI simply as a black box and you just have to trust us. We do, in many experiences that we have built, show you what goes into making the score what it is, right? So if someone has a 3.5 math score, what is underlying that math score in terms of the underlying factors like skills, like work experience, et cetera, that go into it? All of this is done in a transparent fashion, for example, within our talent acquisition product. So this, in a nutshell, is just some of the applications that we have built. We continue to innovate in a material way with many of our customers. You've heard some of the use cases that we've talked about today, and we will continue to innovate on this as a company.
So welcome, and this is kind of the keynote session for this afternoon, and we're fortunate to have Craig here. And I'll go a little bit to introduce myself, and Craig, if you don't mind introducing yourself. So I'm General Counsel of Eightfold, Roy Wang. I happen to have a PhD in AI from many, many moons ago. At Eightfold, I get to use both sides of the muscles, both the AI and the law. And it's a very, very interesting area. And I happened, 2 days ago, I was testifying before US Department of Chamber of Commerce. And just the amount of interest and talk track that regulators are engaging with the industry on this topic is enormous. I also have fortunate experiences talking to all our global customers located in Europe, in US. They all have different nuanced views of this. And sometimes I encounter customers that still treat AI as a us versus them type of question. Like Sachit went through quite a bit of details on what a responsible use of AI could be. But a lot of the talk tracks I hear sometimes are kind of ignoring the nuances that went straight to AI or no AI. It's very interesting in this area. So with that, today we have Craig Leen, who is a former director of OFCCP, and who is also fortunate on our advisory board. Craig, if you don't mind, just introduce yourself a little bit to the audience. You've been at the federal, county, city level.
I have.
Yeah, lots.
Thank you, Roy. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm based in D.C., Washington, D.C. I work at K&L Gates as a partner in the Labor Employment Workplace Safety Group. Much of the focus of my practice is on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs and advising companies, some of the biggest in the country, on how to make sure they get that right and do it in a way that's legal and also effective. And I do a lot of public speaking in that regard. Prior to that, I was the OFCCP Director. Many of you have probably heard of the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Well, the OFCCP is basically the same sort of organization, but for federal contractors specifically. Federal contractors employ about a quarter of America's workforce. And OFCCP, unlike the EEOC, does neutrally scheduled audits of those federal contractors to assess whether they have selection bias, pay equity bias, promotion bias based on race, gender, and a number of other protected classes. Prior to being the OFCCP director, I was the city attorney of Coral Gables, Florida, where I was a strong proponent in Florida of home rule for local governments and on diversity and equity programs for local governments. And I helped create the principles of inclusion for people with disabilities at the city of Coral Gables, which if you ever get a chance, take a look online. I'm very proud of that. I have 2 children on the autism spectrum. My daughter Alex has very profound autism. And much of my life has been seeking to ensure that she gets all the supports that she needs. And I can see how much of a struggle that can be. So that's really informed a lot of the reason why I got into civil rights to begin with. Prior to that, I was a litigator, actually. I was the chief of federal litigation for Miami-Dade County, and before that, chief of appeals. And I've worked at a variety of international law firms. But one other thing that I do, which I just got appointed to, which I'm excited about, is I'm on the advisory committee, the DC advisory committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And we're going to be having our first meeting of this term. It's, I believe, a 4-year term. And I'm going to be focusing a lot on disability inclusion and pay equity. So anyway, that's an overview of what I've done.
Well, that's a lot of things you have done.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing some of the personal details about your family, and I totally see your personal passion in this area. OFCCP is a very, very long acronym.
It is.
I think Lahia actually got the gold prize for spelling out every word of it. So maybe you can just, for people who are not, doing law every day, maybe just say a little bit why EEOC and OFCCP exists, their history, and sort of in plain English, why do we have these agencies? What do they do?
They really come from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Movement. The EEOC was founded in 1965, right after that. And the Uniform Guidelines, which is something that we're going to be talking a little bit about, came about in 1978. OFCCP is part of an executive order that was signed by President Johnson right after the Civil Rights Act of 64. In 1965, Executive Order 11246. And that executive order, unlike many recently, has continued to be in force for many years. So, and it's one where there's a lot of support on both sides of the political aisle, both Democrats and Republicans. They often take slightly different approaches to enforcing it, but both have supported it across administrations. So OFCCP is a long acronym, Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. I often get nervous, I'll say it wrong because it's so long and really doesn't have much to do with what OFCCP actually does in practice, because you would think that it would be into contract compliance and probably more focused on procurement. So like if you have a procurement contract to build widgets, as they would say in law school, we would ensure that you complied with that. Well, that's not what OFCCP does at all. The compliance is completely focused on employment civil rights and making sure that companies are practicing affirmative action and non-discrimination in employment. And let me say one thing about affirmative action, because it's in the news. Affirmative action in employment is different than affirmative action in education. When you're talking about affirmative action in higher education, there are preferences that can be used as one factor among many in determining who to select for a particular college or law school. The affirmative action in employment is actually the opposite. You're not allowed to use preferences or quotas. The goal of affirmative action is to ensure that you're looking at your entire workforce, the workforce demographics, to see if you're overutilized or underutilized as to different race and ethnic groups, and also based on gender. And also disability status and veteran status. And the idea behind it is, if you're underrepresented as to a particular group, then you need to do outreach and recruitment toward that group so that you're treating everybody equally. It's to eliminate barriers to employment and to enhance equal employment opportunity.
And just kind of go a little bit higher level, why is it as a country or as a federal agencies you care about this diversity matching to the population? Like why does that matter?
I mean, it's the reason why the United States, I would submit, is the leading economy in the world, is our diversity, is the fact that people come from all over the world to be here because of the opportunity that's offered, because of our university system, because of the chance to pursue the American dream. So whenever you see underutilization, it means that this country is not getting the most out of its people. So if you know, for example, that in certain industries, women are significantly underutilized, which means that, for example, in finance, it's an industry where at the higher level positions, typically they're 80% men and 20% women. Well, just think about what that means, because typically when you look at availability, which is how many people could that be, what should the percentage be if everyone had the same opportunity, and you look at mid-level and lower-level, entry-level positions, you'll see that it's much closer to 50-50 between men and women. This is true in law as well. It's true in tech. It's true in tenured faculty. These are industries that we focused on at OFCCP. And what it means essentially is that if you're about 50-50 in a law firm or a financial company, an investment bank, and then you end up being 80% men, 20% women, you are vastly underperforming, almost by definition. Some studies show that this economy loses trillions of dollars a year because we underutilize our own talent. So that's what this is about. It's good for everybody. It's good for minorities, it's good for whites, it's good for women, it's good for men. It helps the economy. You want the most talented people to get the jobs. That's ultimately why our country is the top economy.
And earlier today we heard a lot of talks about, especially what stuck in my mind is the Forrester presentation, that they showed that right now the job openings, vacancies vastly outpace historical average in terms of gap between
Yes.
the opening and the availability of workers.
That's true.
And everyone kind of is embracing the remote working culture, so the talent can come from pretty much anywhere.
Yes.
So now you have these new digital skills required and all that, and a lot of skill-based hiring. So maybe I should go to Ashu, because you just presented on the AI and why it's useful, powerful. Maybe you can talk about why AI is the solution here. Maybe dig a little deeper in.
Absolutely. Like, at times I say that the only way to do this is with AI. And I think there are a few different parts. One is the scale at which we are operating today, all of us, the diversity of the data that we are encountering, and the speed at with which we need to act is so much faster than ever. And if I'm like hiring and I'm making those employment decisions, or if I'm making the decisions about who to promote, what learning path to provide to someone, either I can make those data-driven decisions, learn from the data of everyone in the world. And I think that's the key thing, is AI is one of those things. What data you're feeding into it will matter. If you take a very narrow slice of the data, you won't get good outcomes. If you just take your own data, then it's also very limited, no matter how big you are. It's really the diversity of the data you're bringing in over there. And then how do you analyze it? And on that, actually one thing that I tell people is, like, when you think about like what's the big difference between computers and human beings, right? The most common answers are, I mean, as I'm over here, I'm talking about, right, scale, speed, or you can talk about emotions, intuitions, those kind of things, right? Sentiment. But there's one actually extremely powerful difference between humans and machines. For humans, an ability to intentionally forget something, an ability to intentionally ignore something is science fiction. If you have seen the movie Man in Black, right? Someone goes, flashes that light, right? That is science fiction. But for computers, if any one of you have ever made a mistake of DEL, star dot star, or RM, star dot star, some of you might remember those days, right? DOS programming, Unix programming, right? But on a serious note, you can actually, as you're training with AI, right, when we talk about anonymization, you have an ability to control which data goes in or not. Ignore anything that can create a bias. And do that at a scale in real time. And I think in finding these long-term patterns, like I was talking to some folks from Chevron yesterday, right, and to one I mentioned. Actually, I've been in oil industry myself. Now, I don't know how many people even at Eightfold know this or remember this. But in 1996, I was in Alexandria area in Egypt, and literally blasting the oil wells. Oh, yeah. But those experiences, even from 25 years back, may transform, may map to something which is extremely meaningful today. I did this psychometric analysis of mine, and it came back saying that, oh, you're not a risk taker, so you can never be an entrepreneur. And actually, true story. So I was talking to my coach, and he's like, you just don't fit the profile of an entrepreneur. I'm like, why? Because you're not a risk taker. And actually, there's truth over there, and there is not. But on the other hand, if you look at my experience, it is like you went from, on one hand, I took a very traditional career path, like many of us did undergrad in India, came to US, like many of us, with $1,000 in the pocket, that's it. You show up over here. On one hand, you can say it's a huge risk you are taking, right? Leaving your country with almost nothing in your pocket, showing up in a new country. On the other hand, it's an extremely calculated risk. You go do your PhD, almost well-defined that you will get a good job. You go join Google, and now you're well settled. Then you go into a startup, right? On one hand, each of these have a huge risk. On the other hand, each of these are very calculated risks, right? And those patterns, that ability to analyze as a human being is extremely hard. But with machines, because we can analyze the data at a scale, you can find those patterns and make sense out of it. And that's why I say that actually with AI done right, that's the only way to do it.
So Ashu's point about the bias is kind of can be perpetuated because it's unconscious, hard to intentionally forget.
And I will just add one more thing, like when you say, where does the bias comes from, right? Assuming the good intent across the board, right? And I believe 99% of the people have good intent, right, over here. Quite a few times it just comes from our limited knowledge, limited understanding of the data. So it's not just ignore, but also have the full picture.
I'm very bad, like to your point, I'm very bad at intentionally forgetting things. I'm very good at unintentionally forgetting things all the time. Craig, to this point about AI's play into under the law and all that, there is a kind of history of mismatch here because OFCCP law, EEOC, Uniform Guideline all came out roughly 50 years ago before AI was contemplated or implemented at scale. So how do you see AI fitting together with these kind of regulations that are being frozen in time a bit? How do you see the interplay? How do they work together?
Well, let me answer that two ways. First, I'll tell you, looking at it more from a former agency head looking toward the future, I'd say in 10 years, every company will be using AI for all of their employment decisions. You have to, because the studies all show that you can't eliminate unconscious bias, whether it be affinity bias or anchoring bias or confirmation bias, particularly with the way people use social media now, looking up whatever they want to prove. And I asked my son, what's the longest river in the world? And depending on what you type into Google, you can prove that it's the Nile, which it is, the Amazon, the Mississippi. I asked, what's the tallest mountain in the world? You can prove it's Mount Rainier, but you can, not Mount Rainier, Mount Everest. But you can also, well, I grew up in the Seattle area, so it's the tallest mountain in that area, the Mount Everest. But you can also prove it's Mount Chimborazo, which is the closest to the moon, believe it or not. My son is wonderful at using Google and YouTube to find these things out. But the point is that with these forms of biases existing, it's really hard to make good selection decisions completely free of bias unless you use AI. And of course, it should be AI with a human, interacting with it, determining what are the qualifications, determining what are the skills that are needed. But in the end, the ability to process all that information and to come out with, well, these are your top candidates, is extraordinarily useful. If you leave it to people, they will typically leave out a couple individuals who would be qualified. And they will typically be either people of color or women of color. So or people with disabilities. You see it over and over again. When I was the OFCCP director, we would do about 1,000 audits a year. And when we did audits, we would do systemic audits. So we would get all the employment data for a company for the past 2 years typically. We would look at their hiring, we'd look at their pay, but let's focus on hiring and selection because it's the most relevant here. And we would typically find initial indicators, and what an indicator is a 2 standard deviation difference in selection rate between people who are hired who are of one race or another race, or one gender or another gender. And so, for example, we might look, let's say you get 1,000 applicants who are men and 500 applicants who are women. We're not looking at how many men did you hire and how many women did you hire. We're looking at your selection rate. And let's say the rate for men was 30% and the rate for women was 20%. Well, then we're going to look at, well, is that something that could occur by chance or based on the skills of these two groups, assuming their skills are the same? And we would control for all the factors the company uses. And if you know, a 30% versus 20% gap, that's a problem under the uniform guidelines in terms of hiring selection rates, potentially. And it could also be a 2 or 3 standard deviation problem as well. Well, what I'll tell you is we found these sort of hiring disparities a lot, at least initially. And then sometimes we would go back to the company and they would provide us more information. We would control for more information, control for those factors. And we might ultimately make a determination that this was not discrimination, but it could be some form of disparate impact or just a disparity that needs to be addressed over time now that the company knows about it. And so I'm just having been the OFCCP director, this is quite common. And when you look at when I mentioned the different industries before, like tech, finance, law, university faculty, this 80%, 20% difference is generally without AI. I mean, these are people knowing about the EEOC, which, like I mentioned to you, is what, 57 years old. The OFCCP, 56, 57 years old, and yet you still have these numbers? I mean, what's going to fix that? A new generation of people are going to fix it? Probably not. I mean, hopefully we continue to improve over time, but it's AI that will ultimately address this. And so what I often like to say, because we should compare AI to people with unconscious bias, which is better. And my experience, and now having been on the advisory board of Eightfold, is that AI is better if they have all these controls. You saw how earlier on this big screen, all the different ways that you could assess whether the AI was causing bias or not, and how you could eliminate that. You could even assess how your individual not the AI itself, but the qualifications that you choose. How does that impact those who are qualified for a job? So for example, the classic qualification that's often discussed in this area is like a lifting requirement. Because lifting requirements, if they're extremely heavy, will typically cause a disparate impact toward people with disabilities and toward women. Not always, but sometimes. If you have a 100-pound lifting requirement, it may greatly decrease who will be qualified for this job. If it's a 50-pound versus a 25-pound, and at OFCCP, we would often come in and say, why do you have this very heavy lifting requirement when you have machines that you really only need to be able to lift 5 pounds, and yet you have this huge disparate impact against women or against people with disabilities? You need to eliminate that lifting requirement. And typically, they will not be able to validate, or validate means show that it supports a business purpose or a business necessity. And I'll tell you, that's a very simple requirement, but any qualification, it could be a PhD requirement for a particular job where you really don't need a PhD. If you have a physics PhD requirement for a particular job, and that doesn't really enhance the applicant pool, having that, and you don't really need that PhD, a master's would be sufficient, you may find that that PhD requirement has a huge disparate impact against certain race or ethnic groups, or against, a lot of times, men versus women. There may be less women getting physics PhDs, but there may be a lot of women getting physics masters. And I'm not, you never want to overgeneralize, but when you look at the demographic statistics behind a lot of these issues, that's where disparate impact comes from, where you see particular, it's often class-based too, socioeconomic class, an opportunity to have access. And in our country, still to this day, race is often tied, or at least correlated, with socioeconomic status, particularly wealth in this country, because of a lack of opportunity and historic discrimination against minorities, and lack of opportunity for women. And AI allows you to get by all that and focus on the skills themselves and give people an opportunity who may not have had an opportunity in the past. That's why it's good for diversity.
On that degree thing, I recently learned, I think Kamat told me some of the stats, and I Googled it as well. It turned out that tens of millions of US workers don't have a college degree. I think as high as 70 million. I couldn't believe it. I had to Google it, I think from Washington. You told me, then it's trust and verify, Kamat. Trust and verify. And it's shocking to me the number of people that don't have formal degree, but they have the skills. They have alternative skills to do the job. So to your point, some of these job requirements can be relaxed to bring the diversity in to prevent some of these issues is real. And Sachit, maybe you can talk about some of the calibration tool or other tools that you showed that can address that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the way that Craig put it, right, which is basically that the bias actually is pervasive throughout society, right? So if you look for software engineers, for example, right, which is something that right now in Silicon Valley is kind of a hot area from a hiring perspective, it's very difficult to actually find software engineers that are not men, right? Because that bias actually permeates through many, many years that it takes to actually create a software engineer, right? All the way going back to school. And so one of the things that we believe at Eightfold is that we need to provide that transparency over what does the applicant and the potential applicant pool look like based on decisions that you make as talent acquisition leaders or hiring managers. And so some of the transparency that we've actually built into the tool is if you make certain programming languages or certain types of skills required within the tool, or you add certain types of skills that bias towards certain kinds of populations, we'll actually show that to you in real time using your data and using the data that we have at scale. And so those are the kinds of controls that we can put in place, which is maybe you relax a certain requirement, and certainly the diversity percentage in real time shoots up by 10%. Now that gives your talent acquisition teams a way to actually potentially go out there and increase the diversity on your team, right? It takes these little steps to change some of the inequities in society. And again, that's something that we firmly believe in as a company. And it is something that is available within our product.
And coming back to you, Craig, you've in this space for so long, you've seen a lot of enforcement and all that. There are a lot of talent leaders in the audience on Zoom. Is there any, maybe first describe pitfalls you've seen companies do, and then should talk about like best practices that company can do in this kind of
Definitely.
regulatory environment.
I'd say the biggest pitfall I see in diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility programs is not taking a comprehensive approach and using the data that's available to make good decisions, treating it more like an art than a science. So for example, maybe taking a look at your workforce and saying, you know what, we're going to double the percentage of minority executives over the next 5 years, without actually doing a workforce assessment to see what is your representation of minorities and women in these jobs, and disaggregating and looking at individual race and ethnic groups to see if there's an underrepresentation compared to availability. You know, that takes time and it takes some money, but then if you actually have the data, then you can pick accurate goals and you can defend them. If someone asks you, well, this is just a preference, you're just saying that you prefer minorities in this position. And you would say, no, absolutely not. It's not a preference. We analyzed our workforce and we're underrepresented as to minorities. It shows that we're not getting the most talented people because we're missing a lot of potential minority applicants, and that's why we're doing this outreach and recruitment to this group, is to give more opportunity and to get a greater applicant flow. Same with pay equity. It's one thing to say, well, you know, we want to make sure we're paying women and men the same, we're paying white employees and minority employees the same, but it's another thing to actually do a pay equity audit, do a regression analysis, budget for it, and if you find pay disparities, correct them, which is really what the best practice is. Same with inclusion and accessibility. It's one thing to say that we care about including people with disabilities and, you know, maybe even having a nice statement on your website. It's another thing to create a centralized accommodation system, budget for it, and to make sure and to practice principles of universal design where anyone who requests an accommodation will get it, which is the best practice, and many companies actually do. Same with remote work and telework. It's one thing to sort of assess, well, how much remote work can we allow here? A lot of times it's based on people's opinion of remote work and how quickly you want to go back to the workplace, and it's who's ever in power in that particular group that's making the decision. But why not study it and look at, well, how was productivity with remote work? And look, we're getting a lot more applicants. You know that the labor force participation rate for people with disabilities, which has historically been far under the general labor force participation rate, it's about 20% versus about 65%. that it's at the highest it's ever been for people with disabilities because of remote work. And one thing we talked about, and I heard you mention earlier, Ashu, is how women's labor force participation has gone down, in part because of caregiving responsibilities during the pandemic. Well, how are we going to address that? One way is to be more accommodating of caregivers and to have policies in place that are studied that will ensure that a caregiver could perhaps have remote work or telework, which would allow that person to be able to keep their job. So those are the pitfalls.
It's a combination of policy, looking at the data.
Looking at the data and using things like AI. AI allows you to take, as you mentioned, millions, billions, trillions bits of data, depending on how big your organization is, and make the best decisions. It's still people making the final decisions, but now you have all that information. That's why the United States, the military, for example, always wants all the information before it makes its decision. Any organization wants that. You should do that in DEIA too, not just base it on opinions of different people and have debates. Those are great. It's good to have discussion about DEIA issues, but it's more important to put together an agenda for action based on data. And that's why I keep saying that I believe artificial intelligence ultimately will be the standard of care in this industry. I used to be a city attorney, and we used to do a big focus on autonomous vehicles. And I think there's a lot of similarity there because, a lot of city attorneys will tell you in 10, 20 years, that's going to be the standard of care. And it's going to be hard to get a driver's license because people will not drive as well, and that will be negligent, potentially, to drive yourself when you could have your car drive. Same thing with selecting people. Why would you not use AI if it's available to you and instead allow humans to continue doing everything when you know that unconscious bias permeates the whole process?
Yeah, I would like to do one more thing on the technology front, right, is actually the processes have gone really complex. If you take the journey, right, when we are hiring, is first, hiring manager creates a rec, which may start even before by doing the resource planning, forecasting that these are the projects we are going to have, this is the technology investments we have to make over next year, right? And a rec gets created. Now, what level at which we should create that rec? Should be level 4 or level 5 or level 6? Then someone says that, okay, get assigned to a TA team, I need a job description. A hiring manager may say that, okay, let's just cut paste from somewhere or craft it. Or actually seriously think about it and says that, okay, I need these 7 skills. Everyone is hiring data scientists probably in this room as well, right? I'm looking for someone who knows R and Python and machine learning and AI and deep learning. And it's very benign, right? Makes all sense. But as we were doing that, did we introduce a bias? Because number of women who know Python, percentage-wise, is much less than the number of women who know R. And then OFCCP can come in tomorrow and says that, did you make the right criteria or not over there, right? Then we publish it on the website. And a candidate comes in, searches. You go to, let's say, Google's career website today and search for software engineer, and you see a job opening for staff engineer, senior staff engineer, senior engineer. Which one should I apply for? I don't even know what is more senior than the other one, because the job description says that 5 to 8 years of experience. And how does it map to my level? And if a woman or someone, self-selection bias happens, I may end up picking a job which is one level above me or one level below me. And then the pay parity, we can keep talking about all day long, but because I ended up applying to a job which was one level below me, my starting point is 110K versus it could have been 140K. Then the interview process happens. Did we pick the right interviewers? If my interviewer experience is very different from the other one, I can have the bias. Like real story, like when I was at Google, the person got interviewed by 2 different panels. One panel was young people just out of school, so they started asking all the coding questions. The other panel was a lot more senior. They asked all the systems questions for the same job. Now, you didn't pick the right panel. In one case, the person got rejected, another case got the offer. But then when you are doing the offer analysis, are you looking at the comparables in the correct way or not? Or you interviewed this person, and you're like, no, the person is not going to pass. They don't have this specific skill. But on the other hand, if you could have looked at the pipeline in the real time, you could have known that I can train this person in 2 months, and my pipeline is empty, and it may take me 6 months to hire this person, given the demand and supply. So each of the process have gotten so complex, and at each point you're making these decisions, and if you have the access to the data in the real time, your answers could be very different. And I think that is why we keep talking about like why AI is the only way in these things.
So we're running short on time. I want to make sure, anybody from the audience have any questions for any, oh, yes, please. I think, yeah, if someone can hand the mic.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. So can you maybe speak to what we're seeing in the kind of the regulatory space relative to like state of New York with looking at audited AI as a capability, and what do you see as the kind of future of that across both federal and state?
So there are these local laws. I mean, I can talk a little bit.
Sure.
You should chime in.
I have some thoughts.
There are these laws that are existing at the local jurisdiction, right? Like Illinois, New York City, etc. Some are existing, some are new, some are upcoming. They all have different requirements, and that's a struggle that's happening at the state and federal level as well. That's why regulators are all talking to each other. Also, the EU and US, they're all trying to come up with some framework that's consistent, and this is going to be a long journey for that. It's just like uniform guidelines being existent for roughly 50 years. And it's gone through different interpretation and all that. So we'll see these things happening, and it's never a clear binary answer on how you address them. From my perspective, we work with our customers. We help customers analyze the data. We produce some of the metric that Sachit showed earlier. Like we are ready to address these issues, but you will see these kind of legal development constantly. It's not like you're done, then that's it. That's been my experience.
Yes, so I would say first, there's a lot of different types of artificial intelligence in employee selection. And for a long time, just looking at the uniform guidelines, it looks at selection procedures. So if you use a test, a certain type of test, where people have to answer 30 questions, or they have to look into a video and speak or provide information, or they play some games, like video games, to determine their aptitude in a particular area. The regulatory agencies are concerned about that because they're worried that those could potentially have bias against people with disabilities. To the extent you have to speak into the AI against people who have accents, against immigrants, to the extent it looks at people's faces, potentially discrimination based on race or ethnicity or national origin are concerns. So, the regulatory agencies are concerned about that, and at least my experience with Eightfold is we fully understand that. I'm on the advisory board. Vicki Libnick, the former EOC chair, is on the advisory board. I've engaged with Eightfold on these issues. But Eightfold's platform is a lot different than those. So it doesn't use a game or a test or a personality test or things like that and say that that's tied to some sort of level of performance. It's actually basically taking the skills and qualifications that are needed for a particular job and assessing that in a much more efficient and comprehensive way than people can do it. So, my thinking is it will be defensible, easily defensible, because that's not really the type of AI that the regulatory agencies are concerned about. Because it's not a game. I mean, the way you get a good score from Eightfold is have the qualifications and skills needed for a particular job. That's what validation is. And so now talking about New York in particular, I know being on the advisory board that Eightfold has been focusing on that a lot and has a lot of different ways to show that it's not biased. And we'll be able to do that. One thing I like about it, though, from an EEO perspective, and I think that the regulatory agencies will like if they ever assess it, is the fact that it helps you with recruiting diverse talent, that it helps with affirmative action. It helps identify talent that may be missed, which typically benefits women and minorities. Likewise, it allows you to profile mask, which is a big one. Because of unconscious bias, there's always, and sometimes explicit bias, the profile mask allows you to assess people based on their talents, not on a protected class. And then, in fact, you can actually use Eightfold's data to assess, well, when someone who's a woman or a person with disability or a minority gets the highest score, how often are they picked? You could assess that, you know, and see, oh, well, why is this hiring manager, typically when the white applicant has the highest score, they get picked, but when the black applicant has the highest score, they don't. And it allows you to identify different issues of bias within your organization and then do training to address it. So this ability to assess disparate impact or adverse impact in real time is going to be extremely helpful to companies in interacting with regulators, in my opinion. So I do know that Eightfold is very focused on like the New York laws and the different laws, and you all could talk about that more if you want. But in the long run, I think Eightfold is the sort of AI that I think you're going to see federal regulators embrace and really want companies to be using because it will eliminate unconscious bias.
I just, from personal experience, I talked to regulators, I testified before regulators. A lot of the conversation have been around biometrics because people fear that, you know, your face recognition is like a face print, right? Like fingerprint. That somehow if you use that to, there's some sort of creepiness factor to it, that there's some suspect. So there are a lot of conversation around that kind of biometric identity concept in surveillance area, in employment as well. People,
definitely.
Yeah. So that's one regulator to talk about that. That's like one example that pops in their mind is the biometrics.
And they're very concerned that there may be certain people who will never be able to get a job if a certain form of AI is used because of their race or their accent or their disability. That's what they're concerned about because they want everyone to have a chance at a job. Now, looking at Eightfold's AI, well, the way you get a job is have the skills and qualifications. They're going to mask the protected class. So it helps you get that job.
I think we're behind the time. Is it okay? One last question then, yeah.
I'm not sure how articulate I can be about this, but turning the question upside down, we've been talking about applicants. But there are some companies that want to attract a diverse applicant pool. But because there's cognitive biases about, well, I would never want to live in that city or that region or whatever, that inhibits them from recruiting the type of talent that they want to do. So that's a challenge for companies that are, let's say, in the legal world, the Mansfield requirement. It might be easier to comply with that in Chicago or LA, but it may not be as easy, let's say, in other parts of the country. So how can we think about that, and how can Eightfold help us solve that problem?
Well, you know, I think that the movement toward remote work will address that to some extent, those biases, about geographical biases, things like that. And, you know, we'll see what organizations do. I think if they move back away from remote work, it is going to decrease diversity. It is probably going to decrease employment of underrepresented groups in whatever geographical area they are. And it's going to probably decrease employment of people with disabilities who often rely on remote work, telework opportunities. So in terms of what Eightfold can do is, if, you know, a lot of it in the end depends on the company though. You know, if you have a remote work policy, Eightfold's going to help you because it'll be able to assess the talents of a broader pool. If you decide to contract that pool by only having a very small geographical area where you recruit, Eightfold will still help you because it will identify people you might not have thought would be good at this particular job. So it's still going to be helpful to diversity. But in the end, a lot of it's still the policies of the company. And Eightfold is a tool that can help assist you. But I do think it'd be very helpful if you have a broad remote work or national work policy and you're recruiting people from all over the country, then you're going to need, and you're getting thousands of applicants, then you need AI to really assess those and to pick out the top talent.
Yeah, to be more specific, right, the way that we could help is to actually give you real-time data on what the specific choice that you're making in terms of geographic location, what kind of impact it's going to have on your talent pool, and what removing that requirement actually does, right? So that kind of data can be useful in terms of determining what's the right step.
And that's a very popular topic. I mean, some companies expand even internationally. You can live not just in one. I mean, that's very avant-garde. It's interesting.
And you can even do it by broadening the circle each time to see. That's really useful for decision makers. And I think regulators are going to really like that you can assess that.
So I'm being told by multiple people now that the time is up. So I don't want to prevent you from going to the next event. So thank you very much for participating. Thank you for our panelists. So
thank you.